Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'll be your host today, and we're going to be talking about what players really want from games. Game developers spend years trying to make their games fun, but the answer to finding the fun for players may have less to do with mechanics and more about how players actually feel. So today, in this episode, we're going to explore what fulfillment actually means from both the players' and developers' perspective, and how design decisions influence that experience. We'll discuss everything from progression systems to player motivation and the trade-offs that teams face when balancing business goals with meaningful player experiences. And the difference might be smaller than you think and more impactful than you expect. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everyone, and we're back. And today with us, I have none other than Michael Tsarouhas. Mike, how's it going?
Hey, it's going good, Andrew. How are you doing?
Not too bad, not too bad. And so, Mike, you are the lead game designer and consultant at Tsarouhas Consulting, right? And please tell us a little bit more about your past experience, what you do as a consultant and game designer, and would love to hear a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of got started in the industry around 2013. I got started in the design, like narrative design and voiceover area on a project called Insurgency. I was involved in the modding community before that for a few years, making mods like the Half-Life 2 mod Underhell I worked on. And then from there, I went into a proper source engine project of Insurgency. I did that for a few years. I moved around. I was working on the community team. I was a community manager. I did voiceover direction. I eventually kind of made my way back around to design, but expanded from the narrative side of things into like the lead design role on the project Insurgency Sandstorm. And that was like the bulk of my work in those earlier years. I also worked on a bunch of different source engine projects doing narrative design, voiceover. Black Mesa is probably the biggest one where I wrote maybe like half of the HECU Marine dialogue and also voiced it and, designed some scenes for them. And then continue with the Insurgency stuff. Also worked on another New World Interactive project from the creators of Insurgency called Day of Infamy, and was the voiceover director there. But I kind of found my way into that lead design role. From New World, after Insurgency Sandstorm and other stuff, I moved on. I decided to get into VR. I worked on a project called Onward for Meta in VR, which is really cool because I always liked the military tactical shooter aspect of game dev and just as a gamer. And then I was going to do that, but in the virtual reality space, which I had no experience in. So that was a cool thing to get adjusted to. And after that, I decided I wanted to form my own business, Tsarouhas Consulting, and that is what I'm doing right now. I work in the areas of design and comms and marketing and project evaluation, pitch deck creation, monetization, all different kinds of things, because I've been lucky enough to develop some familiarity with all those avenues throughout my career since, I guess it's been about 13 years now.
Nice. And that's quite a breadth, and I absolutely love that too because of, just all the different experiences that you get and how you can apply them to all these different areas and stuff. It's extremely helpful and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's something that it's very exciting for me too. I'm somebody who's always enjoyed bouncing around from different stuff, and not just obviously being challenged and learning new stuff is cool, but also being able to do all of it at once in a way that still produces value is pretty cool. And that's what's perfect about consulting, right? Is you come on with a client, they have unique needs, and you help them with those unique needs in whatever the avenue is. And you're always learning and being challenged in different areas instead of just doing one singular thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And there, you're right. There is a lot of value that comes with that too, because let's say you as a studio, a dev, you're always working on that one project, and then you go to the next, and the only other types of real learning you can have essentially is within your own project, and obviously whatever else you consume and learn about too. But there's just That's what it comes down to, right? And why we're even having these conversations here on the show is like those conversations are so helpful as another way to learn and everything else, especially when it's more one-on-one and similar type of collaborations and stuff. So appreciate you sharing more about yourself, but we do want to take some time to get to know you a little bit more. And how we do that here on the show is have you go through the Q Box round, which is just a few quick random questions we prepared here today. So, Mike, the question first is, are you ready for the Q Box round?
Yes, I'm ready. Go.
First is biggest gaming pet peeve. What is it?
It's definitely, this is not a unique answer, but it's the truth. Bad UI. And I think it is kind of easy to thumb your nose and speak poorly of like bad UI. It's easy to make mistakes when it comes to you, and I try to be sympathetic to that. But despite that, as a gamer, I will get pretty easily frustrated when a UI is bad. I think a big part of why UI gets bad is because it gets over-iterated on and changes happen when they weren't really necessary. And that bothers me because, just like any gamer who boots up a game and wants to get through the menu, I just want to play, or I just want to understand what's happening. Yeah. And that's often what UI is for.
Yeah, because that clarity matters, right? It makes the experience what it is, or intended for, at least. All right.
Yeah.
Next is, what's your childhood favorite game?
That I have to cheat for and say it's a tie. It's between my less interesting and obvious answer, I guess, Half-Life 1, right? Because I worked on Black Mesa, and because I'm a millennial gamer, and I like FPS games. Like Half-Life 1 was right at the correct time in my brain's development where I was getting attached to things, I guess, and I was a child. And I got really into the space. It was mysterious. It was vast. I never played too much Quake or Doom or that other stuff. So I wasn't even aware of like the delta, right? The change in FPS level design and mood and atmosphere and storytelling between those games. But I still was very enchanted by it. So Half-Life 1, it's a tie between them and actually a SWAT 3. I was always a big tactical shooter fan, and I like the lethality. I like the minimal HUD. I like the realistic aesthetics. But SWAT 3 to me had all that, and also an important factor of like core loop innovation. SWAT 3, I think, was the first game that took the tactical shooter core loop of aiming, shooting, moving, and introduced, well, what if you were the police and you weren't supposed to shoot everybody, right? And that's something that was carried on into SWAT 4, which carried on into nowadays, obviously inspired by the SWAT series, Ready or Not. That kind of core loop innovation is so important in FPS games, and you don't see it a lot always. Like, it's very difficult, especially nowadays. We have all our conventions set up. But SWAT 3, I think, is one of those undersung core loop innovative games.
Awesome. Love hearing it. And yeah, especially like the progression in terms of how even like you just said with a particular IP, evolves in time and stuff like that. And it's really interesting to see. All right. Last but not least, and the staple here on the show is, what game are you playing now?
Am I allowed to swear, Andrew?
You can.
Because I was trying to measure. I'm playing a blank load of Slay the Spire 2.
Okay.
I'm playing so much. I am mainlining that game straight into my veins. Even though like I'm obviously a big FPS guy, Slay the Spire really got its hooks in me. It's just so the unlocking, the pace at which you unlock stuff, the aesthetics of it, the challenge, the sense of player mastery as you play is just beautiful. I really like Slay the Spire 2 a lot. And then secondarily, I don't know, some old school stuff. I recently got a Boiling Point Road to Hell, which is like a Ukrainian developed Far Cry inspired game, and Vanquish, which is like an old, I think it was by the guy who did Resident Evil 4, like a third person action game.
Nice. I absolutely love how you let that in. Can I swear? That's great.
Yeah, I was going to say an S load, but I didn't want to violate anything.
Yeah, you would have been fine either way, but I appreciate it nonetheless. Hey, Mike, thanks for sharing all that with us and everything else. And now, hey, let's get into the conversation, because I know we were talking briefly at the beginning how much I'm really excited about this. And folks, as I shared in the intro, we're here talking about what players really want from games. And I know this is a big one. A lot of us think about that to an extent, and we're trying to like think of ways of, hey, how do we get this information? So that's really what we're here to discuss today. So to kick it off, Mike, do you think the industry often confuses fulfillment with engagement, retention, or fun? And if so, where do those differences matter the most?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. To me, at first, like the thing that we need to do is define fulfillment
Mm.
and what's evidence of that. For me, fulfillment is a goal, and it's subjective, obviously, but it's kind of measured by two things. The first one is what I would call long-term, slow burn mastery of a game, which is basically just saying you're getting better and you notice yourself getting better. That to me is an important component of fulfillment. That could be everything for fulfillment, or it's at least an important component. And then the second thing I think is kind of like, I guess what you would call story forming, where a game is fulfilling if you feel like you are making stories out of it, stories that you remember in your head as anecdotes or stories that you share with your friend. The examples being things like, one time in 7 Days to Die, my friends and I built a base on stilts, and the explosive zombies came and they blew up the stilts and we all collapsed. It was hilarious and frustrating. Or one time in Dwarf Fortress, my queen got obsessed with making finely produced bucklers and it bummed out the whole colony and she got depressed or whatever. Those, I think if you have games that make you think of little stories like that, or if you have a game where you can feel yourself getting better and you want to get better, that's fulfillment. And yeah, I think that as far as a lot of games go, because of the challenges of game development and of production and of putting out content and the difficulty of creating innovative things to create that fulfillment, you sometimes get features that are a little they aim for that. They aim for like retention rather than fulfillment, and they kind of mask that as fulfillment. It's not just people playing the game over and over. It could be, fulfillment could be brought about by those kinds of retention features, people coming back, but it's not necessarily there. An example that I would bring up is one from a game that I worked on, right? Insurgency Sandstorm. We put in what we called limited time playlists. And the idea with limited time playlists was like, well, what if just for fun you did like a playlist where it's all the normal game modes, but everybody only has bolt action rifles. Okay, won't that change the play in an interesting way? Now, instead of their reliable machine guns and assault rifles, everybody's playing a little more cautiously. Every shot matters more. And that is a retention feature, right? And that's important, but ultimately that's just a piece of getting to the goal of fulfillment. The fulfillment comes if the mode is strong enough and if the experience of the game is strong enough where they're playing it and they go, wow, I was playing a limited time bolt action playlist and I fired down a lane and I got 3 kills with 1 shot and it was awesome. There's a story, there's evidence of fulfillment.
I really like the distinction you have with those 2 points, because one is definitely, like, I would say, associated more with game progression, right? Which, we understand and see and are pretty involved with. But then there's that other one that you called out, the stories. Another word that I've used, I think, in some episodes before is memorable moments, right? Shared stories, memorable moments, all those things. And it's really interesting because when we look at some of these things and stuff, we could probably recognize in some capacity, but we're still, like you called out, calling to things like retention and really focusing on that, but not really because every game's different. And so we just throw this word around, retention, because we know that's a big thing in terms of, hey, if you have a high retention rate, that's, higher daily active players. But then you go back to other things like, hey, this could really help with influencers and the repeat content, right? So we're like, oh, retention, but we're never looking even deeper, like you called out. It's like, what really defines that? And it's important to know because, like I said, each game's different. So I love those 2 important distinctions and diving in a little bit deeper on them, because I think it really helps us kind of gauge, where it is that fulfillment really lies. I don't know. It just puts a whole new level of understanding behind games and how we're not just gamers, but we're people.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's important to think about how, and I don't mean to speak ill of retention features, but right. It's important, I think, to talk about like the goal there. Yeah, they're necessary and they're good and they can lead to fulfillment, but it's important to draw the distinction, so to speak, and also like acknowledge when a retention feature is just shallow, be critical of ourselves and of each other and say like, well, this retention feature, this will bring people back, but not because they're having fun, because they don't want to miss out on something. The FOMO, right? The fear of missing out. That's another, I think, important component of it too.
So I want to kind of go deeper into this idea of fulfillment, what makes things fulfilling for players, right? And one thing I'm curious is like, what are some of the common design assumptions developers might make about player satisfaction that you believe are often incorrect? Because I'm sure we can often make lots of mistakes in these situations.
Yeah, I think one that that's pretty common. I guess I just mentioned it is devs making an assumption that something needs to change, and that often happens with the as we were just talking about, an assumption that like no, this isn't good enough. Players want this because we saw one Reddit post, right, with, I don't know, 20 upvotes saying they need that. So let's focus on that. There's a lot of reasons why I might focus on that, right? Maybe it's like an easy win. Maybe it's something that the developer thought was a good idea to begin with. But I think that's an assumption, is like assuming that there's some change that needs to be made when really it's fine and the focus is needed elsewhere. There's another assumption that's a little bit like easy to say, and I think a lot of devs will say this, but I really mean it, and I feel my track record will prove it, hopefully, which is devs assume players don't know what they want in terms of design. I think that you should never design democratically or by committee, even internally. That wouldn't work, so I'm definitely not advocating for that. But I've definitely encountered a lot of developers on my teams and off my teams that assume that players, well, they don't know what they want. That's not, they're never going to be able to communicate to us. That's not true. And this might sound like grandstanding or something, but it is true that we're creating experiences for other people, and like they have some understanding. We just have to take that and marry that with our own knowledge of game development, our own vision of what the project should be, and the things that we know about the game of which the players are understandably ignorant of. So it should never be like fully democratic, as funny as it is to say, but it should be something that you always listen to players, obviously. And then the third thing, I guess, would be devs assume that similar to what I was just saying about something needs to change. More specifically, I think games fall into this trap where they don't really know where to go and they don't know what the next step should be. So they do these post-release, elaborate, fundamental gameplay rebalances, and they assume players want that. They're like, oh, players like there's a problem here, and players are experiencing this issue with the gameplay because the movement is too fast and this is too much. So let's make these huge sweeping changes. And I don't think players are as open to that as devs assume them to be. Players get used to something and they like it and they're playing because they like that thing. So when you go and you overhaul this thing about movement or combat or aiming or recoil or something like this that's like really fundamental to the game, you have to be very careful. There's times when it's fine and it's justified. But if you release a game and you go tear out the underneath of it and try to replace it, you have to be very, very careful. And I've noticed there's an assumption that things are wrong in my work when really I don't think there is anything wrong. And what they really want is new content and features.
Yeah, that's such an important point right there too. And you know what? It's funny, as you were saying that too, I could see how, the last thing you were talking about in terms of those gameplay balances that are assumed that are needed, that they can, in one way, shape, or form, can stem from that other belief of, hey, players don't know what they want. And I think a big part of that too is not necessarily that they don't know what they want, and I think we all have this problem in some way, shape, or form. It can be very difficult to articulate what that want might be. And plus, if you look at how do players communicate information to developers in a lot of cases, there might be forums, you have Reddit, you have like maybe surveys. There's all these different types of things. But if you look at kind of the culture behind how people are communicating and what that actually is, it's just kind of out in the open on the web. It's just like, hey, whatever, I'm just going to say what's on my mind right now. Am I going to take all this time to like really articulate and think about what I'm going to say? No, I'm just going to write that review real quick. And there, I think, lies the kind of that like translation problem, if you will, in a way, which leads to this belief that you called out, or this is my take on it. Yeah, players don't know what they want, but probably couldn't be further from the truth.
No, yeah, that's a really good point you make about articulation and like communication. As developers, it is, at least on some level, our responsibility to establish ways to get that. That's why we set up social media accounts, right? Yep. That's why we have Discords. That's why we have sections of Discords that are about feedback. And that's why we as developers must go to the Steam forums, as painful as it might be sometimes, or go to social media and read and kind of collate. And it's why we have community teams. I'm a big fan of surveying, and maybe I could talk a little bit more about that later, but like surveys are really effective and helpful. Again, they're just an important data point. It doesn't mean like you do whatever gets the
Yeah.
most votes, option B, that's the choice. But that's a good way to give people the ability to articulate that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious now, what about things like progression systems or rewards? I know that's probably a big one depending on the game types and obviously, player agency. Like how do those types of things contribute to fulfillment differently than let's say just simple engagement metrics we might be following if we have analytics or anything else?
Yeah, this is a good one for me because I feel like I kind of learned this the hard way. We had this sort of assumption early on with the Insurgency series development of like just give people everything, and we didn't like the idea. We wanted to stand in contrast to a lot of what the games were doing, the other shooter games were doing at the time, where they made you just run, they made you grind, right? They made you run down the track of unlocks and unlock all these things, weapons, abilities, whatever, because it's frustrating. It felt like we were playing MMOs and they were all grindy, but I think we swung a little too hard the other direction. I think one of the ways that you can get a player to fulfillment is make sure they stay and don't get frustrated long enough to get fulfilled. And that is what got us to where we eventually got to with the progression of Insurgency Sandstorm. So, for example, when we started out, you could access any of the classes, right? You could get access to all the different weapons and stuff. And it was very overwhelming, I think. But then we introduced this system where you would actually need to level up a little bit. And it was fast. And it was still fun. You still had some choices, but you were getting five choices instead of 25, right? And that reduced choice anxiety a lot. So you really need to not overwhelm players when it comes to progression systems at first, and let them like slowly get onboarded so they understand what's happening. Not everybody has a friend that can play with them to say, "Oh, just grab that," or "Play as this class," or "Do this." Point. Sometimes you come on only, and that refund window of I think it's 2 hours and 2 weeks. That's pretty sensitive. So as developers, we need to make sure people don't come in getting frustrated. So that's I think one way. You also need like a good I think baseline for progression. I'm a fan of like 80% of your unlocking and stuff will be time invested, right? So like as long as I'm just playing, I'm going to get XP, right, to get stuff unlocked. But then 20% is skill based. So if I perform really well, I'm going to get up to a 20% boost and I'm going to level up faster. You can't punish bad players too much. You need to, teach them, and failure needs to be fun to some extent, or at least keep you going. And if it's a hardcore game, obviously you need the failure. You can't remove the failure, even if it's not a hardcore game. It's a game. But you do need to make sure that people who want to learn and they're eager to learn aren't getting like totally screwed, basically, if it's like 80% skill based and 20, and the opposite of what I said. And then, finally, again, I guess, just like I was saying, balanced gameplay is important, learning from failure, feeling you can affect the world. Those are all important to leading to fulfillment. And I think like all that in total is creating progression that makes people stay and makes them get to that point of fulfilling themselves. People aren't really fulfilled just from unlocking things purely. They're fulfilled from, the gameplay experiences offered through the unlocks, but they need to be onboarded and they need to be excited with the rarer things that they'll get later on down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. With these things that we just talked about, everything from design assumptions to, progression systems and stuff, when things kind of don't go right? And a big indicator of that is when players stop engaging with the game. What does that usually signal? And because it could be a design failure, there could be some type of fulfillment gap, or it could be something else entirely. So what do we start looking for when we see something like that happening?
I think it's usually a design failure, and it's, by the way, that's super subtle. Like, what's the design failure? Mm-hmm. Failures plural, whatever that could be. Because ultimately, like, if people are bored of a game, it wasn't designed well enough, right? It wasn't fun enough. It's I guess you could argue maybe people are bored of a game. The design's fun, but the art doesn't look very good, or it doesn't stick out artistically speaking. That could be it. But I think it's usually a design failure. It's It could also just mean other things, though. Like, it could just mean that the player has come to their natural end. In the industry nowadays, especially, there's this huge focus on live service and post-release releases of updates. But it's also okay for games to just end, and I think that's fine. It's something the studio needs to keep in mind. Obviously, you need to sell enough copies and have enough of a community to develop the next game, hopefully. But also it's fine for a game to end and a player to stop engaging. So in that case, it's not a design failure. They beat the story.
Yeah.
They got to the end and then they stopped with it, and that's okay. But that's me being like, I guess, a little more literal. Another reason that's not a design failure could be post-release content. The drip might be a little bit slow. Maybe you get to a point where your players are excited for more content and they want more, but they don't have anything that's coming through to them. They don't have modding tools that allows them to give themselves more content. They run into these problems. And I guess examples might be like I don't think people say Still Wakes Deep is like a bad game, right? Because there's nothing to do at the end. You beat the story, you feel fulfilled from the story, it feels memorable. Maybe you demonstrated that mastery. Maybe you have that story in your head of like what you took away from that narrative. Or in the other case, like Battlefield 6 has been criticized for this. And I think I understand why players do get frustrated by that. Like they want more content. They've been fed a lot and they need more, and they'll tune out. They'll just stop playing because they're not getting the drip feed that they're hoping for.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing too, because it's like, and it depends, right? Like there's certain situations where people definitely want that, and you created that demand, but then what does it look objectively from, a business perspective? What's that next thing forward? Like, I mean, I would hope in most cases that people would know, what does that operational cost look like to keep supporting this product, even if it's in a smaller way, like if it's just DLC or whatever other content releases that are coming. But the other way to look at it too is it sustainable, or do we really need to focus on that next project? And I mean, there's other obviously variables too, but it could be one of those tough things too. But there are opportunities, or sometimes missed opportunities, where people aren't pursuing those types of things either. But yeah, it's kind of crazy. And then of course, like you said earlier, that if people are stopped playing, it's like with everything in this industry, it depends.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. It really depends on the project and your goals and your business. I think often though, if we're considering the cases where like you want people engaging as much as possible, it's either a design failure or it's like the post-release stuff isn't coming out fast enough or often enough.
Yeah.
Or the game's just run its course.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because, I mean, some things, they do have a shelf life. And it's hard to determine what that is. You can get an idea, but you never know. So it's great. I want to kind of dive in a little bit more behind balancing, but more particularly with aspect of monetization, right? And I'm curious how developers should approach monetization decisions, at least, without compromising the player experience they're trying to create. Because I know, especially with live op games, this can be a big issue.
Yeah. I mean, as I'm actually very, I would say, invested in monetization because I've found it to be in my career an interesting challenge. You, as a developer, you want to keep making the game. I'm pretty sure every developer, if you ask them, was there ever stuff you wanted in this released game that didn't make the cut? And they would all, 98%, I'm willing to say, would say yes, right? We all want more. One of the ways that we have been able to have that happen after the game actually comes out is through post-release monetization. The practice that's become more acceptable is specifically around cosmetics. You're not buying something that's extra, like going to make you better at the game, in a multiplayer game at least. Or, of course, like, a DLC that's extra content, which is a little more acceptable, I think, in single-player environments, because in multiplayer, you're splitting your community. One of the challenges that we had with Sandstorm, again, was we wanted to be able to add more updates to the game, but the game had to keep making money. And we basically had decided, okay, we're going to try to monetize. We're going to do it the right way. So what does that even look like? The big thing and that was kind of came on me, and it was tough because there weren't any other tactical shooters at the time that were monetizing their stuff, except for maybe Arma 3, but they were a little more focused on like proper DLC content releases. Nobody was doing it, as far as I know, that was just purely in a cosmetic sense. So that was on us, and we had to figure out a way to do it. And the way my guidelines were as follows for how to do monetization: stay thematic. Nobody likes when things break the aesthetic. Nobody likes when things look ridiculous or goofy. I think you could finally see Call of Duty has pivoted away from a lot of that stuff because a lot of players complained and said, well, we don't want to just see this new brand in the game or this other new brand represented in the game, whether that's a popular show or a musician or whatever. That felt kind of shallow and unimmersive to them, we could say. It wasn't thematic. It wasn't aesthetically appropriate. And now you could see with Modern Warfare 4 and what they're pushing is they want to try to take a move away from that. So staying thematic is super important. And I feel for the most part, we had our missteps. We did with Sandstorm. You also need to establish tolerance with players and figure out what they want. That's something that I was big on when I talked about surveying. I surveyed players, or we surveyed players, and I was very involved with the surveys. I think I wrote most of them saying, hey, so we're going to add new content to the game. I didn't talk about the monetization specifically. I said, what do you want to see? The best example I could think of is a game an update like Operation Breakaway. It was our 1.8 update for Sandstorm. I asked players, so what do you want to see? And I looked through the data and I was noticing a lot of people were interested in seeing more bullpup assault rifles, okay, which are like short-barreled assault rifles that are better in close quarters environments and getting in and out of vehicles and stuff. And they also felt like the insurgent team, because it's a game about security forces versus insurgents, security forces being like military, government-aligned militias, mercenaries, special operations, whatever, versus the insurgents, who are like rebels, clandestine operatives supporting this proxy force, mercenaries, whatever. The insurgents, they didn't like their aesthetics that much. And I thought, okay, so how can I combine these things? People want more of these bullpups and they want better insurgent aesthetics. And we formed a sort of theme around the update of there's a rogue element to the security forces that break away and join the insurgency. Happens all the time. And we'll say the people that have done this are more aesthetically interesting. They're the police forces and the special operations forces have joined the insurgents. Now we've brought the aesthetics that people preferred, security aesthetics, onto the insurgent team while still, maintaining the gameplay needs of target identification, identifying who's on what team. And we do that narrative focus in a big city where there's been an explosion of the cops essentially and special operations betraying the security forces. And because it's a city map, it makes sense to have bullpup assault rifles, close quarters stuff to contribute to that. By taking all that data and combining it into a theme like that, and by the way, not monetizing all of it because the weapons and the maps or the map was free and part of the cosmetics were free, that allowed us to say, okay, we've satisfied players, we've given them what they want, it's mostly free, but there's this optional monetization to it. You can pay for the cool special operations guy, or you can unlock the other, cop aesthetic. That to me was the perfect combination of figure out what's fair to be monetized, target it toward what players actually want to see, solve the problems aesthetically, and then charge for it fairly.
Yeah, and what I love about that approach too is you broke this. I've shared this word, used this word several times and stuff on the show, but through that approach that you just called out, staying thematic, what is a tolerance? You essentially were able to have a real clear understanding of what those intrinsic motivators and what's so important from an intrinsic level for these players. And really honed in and focus on that. And wow, what a process to say, hey, we created all this content and everything, and then we're taking all the data behind it, and they're how can we in a meaningful way monetize what we just did? And it's still on theme. It's all these other things are still applying. So it's it's just really cool to see things done that way, because sometimes, especially with monetization and especially in the live ops games, it's all right, how can we make more money? And maybe that might not be initially the intent, but at the end of the day, it usually is. But then things are being done for the wrong reasons.
Yes. And that's the part that anytime we talk about monetization, we have to acknowledge is a lot of monetization really sucks, And I think that's part of why, just like I was saying, a lot of players were upset with Call of Duty because it felt like their monetization strategy was just about the warm, fuzzy feelings we get from seeing our favorite, the brands, I guess, shows, musicians, etc. And that's that to me is a shallow, less appropriate way to do it. And for what we were going for, we knew we couldn't do that. It would aggravate people, especially because we were trying to be a quote unquote realistic tactical shooter. And I got to say this too, ideally, I think most developers would agree with this. We don't want to do that. Monetization is kind of a necessary thing to keep the health of the game going and to keep the lights on, because the only way we would be able to give all those things to players was because we made more money to keep
Correct.
working on those things. It's a pretty, that sounds like a simple calculation, but I think it's easy to forget. But you always have to make sure that your players are okay with it, obviously, and that you stay on theme, and that you ask them what they want to see. And by the way, this is another point I guess I should be more explicit about, that you give the free stuff too. It can't all be paid for. I think that's too fragmenting, that's too annoying, and it's too disruptive. You need to have that free content there. People who played Operation Breakaway, they didn't have to buy the Rogue Spec Ops pack, but they could play on the map just like everybody else. They could use the weapons, and that was good. And then another final point, I guess, that I forgot is checking out competitors is another way I think developers should approach it. Like, see what the other projects are doing. Don't copycat them. Don't mimic them completely. Try to innovate and check with your players, et cetera. Stay thematic, blah blah blah. But you could get a good quick read if you look at what some of the other games are doing. I couldn't enjoy that privilege because Sandstorm was, as I'm saying, I think we were the first ones to do it in the tac shooter space, at least. So we had to take some risks, and we learned from some of them too. We upset our players more than once with some of the aesthetic choices that we made. So learning from that and looking at competitors is also helpful.
Yeah, competitors and comparison in that is definitely helpful too, and everything. I want to switch gears real quick though for a moment, because I think this would be really interesting, because a lot of what we've been talking about too has been player fulfillment, what players want, and all that stuff. Obviously, it's the focus. But are there any ways that teams can not just unintentionally undermine player fulfillment, right? We identified some of those, but what about their own fulfillment, during production and everything else? What does that relationship look like between player fulfillment and team dev fulfillment? And are there things that we're doing potentially to undermine that for ourselves and our players?
Yeah, I think the big one is maybe not obvious, but an important one to talk about. Releasing buggy games and updates. That's a big part of getting to fulfillment, I think, is just making something that's functional on a base level, that's presentable to a content creator who's worried about every single minute of what they're streaming. If stuff's broken, then you need to be very very mindful and say, okay, well, we got to fix this, because otherwise people aren't going to stick around long enough to get engaged. So even though that's not around the creative, interesting space of design, right, or the sensitive space of retention features, monetization, whatever, just stuff that's working properly is super important. And another one is, I guess, what I talked about before, those navel-gazing gameplay reworks. You're not going to really support the game and create more opportunities to get new people to come in and feel fulfilled if you're totally rebalancing things for dubious reasons, right? Yeah. You're distracting from the more important work. And then another one, I think, is getting distracted in general, a dev team, getting distracted by the fun new ideas, the shiny new toy, when you really need to be finishing existing things and just focusing on shipping.
Yeah, and I think that last one's probably the most important, especially as it relates to developer and studio fulfillment, because it's you'll be in that moment, right? When you're designing something hey, let's do this feature. And it's essentially scope creep and all these other things. But then think about it, because when you were saying that, I'm oh, that will eventually could lead to burnout pretty quick. And then
sure,
there you go, among other things. But and still, no one's saying that burnout is fulfilling. I hope not. I'd find it hard to believe, but at any rate. But yeah, no, I think that was probably the biggest one that stood out to me is and it's so easy, right? It's so easy to that shiny object.
God. I've been in situations where you have a meeting and the goal is to cut down, and it's brought about by, hey, this is a problem. We have to cut back. We have to stop getting distracted by the shiny new toys. And it can happen where you come out of that meeting, you're wow, so we added a new level. We added 8 new weapons. We added all these things. We were supposed to be trimming. That's more common, I think, than people would think, because it's too exciting. And when you're planning things out, and especially if you're in the indie or AA space, but even AAA too, you're not making good estimates. You're not doing a good job at your production due diligence.
Yeah, and another way to look at it too is, let's say, here's the features list we're working on. But then next thing you know, let's say you have a particular release coming up or whatever. It's what do you, it really comes down to prioritization, right? Because sometimes some of those features lists that you're working on, are they absolutely essential for that experience you're trying to do? For the final one, obviously you want everything, but let's say if you're putting out a demo and then you plan later to have a demo update. Prioritization is kind of another aspect of that shiny toy thing where it's like, but it's probably more challenging because it's like, well, we decided this is a list. This is what's getting done. But then what's happening is other issues can stem from those tasks and everything else. And then next thing you know, it's like, oh, we're not hitting our deadlines. And then that cycle continues.
Yep. Yeah, it's rough, man. I mean, everybody's guilty of it. It's not just indies, but indies and modders especially could be very bad at it. The shiny new toy thing. Production is super important. Some semblance of you don't necessarily need to have Jira, right? Or for people who don't know, like task management software, but you do have to be disciplined, and you do need to make sure that you're focused, have a good minimum viable product. You know, all these things are important, completely unsexy practices that aren't fun to talk about and figure out, but they are really important. And they can enable a lot of creativity and focus to flourish, to release, and to actually fulfill players.
Yeah, exactly. And I like looking at it too from that perspective too, like have that minimal viable product, right? But then maybe, and it might not be as cool as you wanted it, but it's like, and there's the next version. Maybe it's DLC, maybe. And now you have this whole plan forward on how you can build off of that one thing. And if that one thing was already good, then there you go. You have, there's lots of ways to go about doing that. For people listening today, if anyone wanted to kind of use this concept we talked about, fulfillment, as a guiding design principle from the get-go, from now, whenever, what practical questions would you think they should be asking themselves throughout the development?
I think there's one really good one and a strong, like kind of encompassing one, which is the following. Ask yourself, how does, or 1 hour played feel different for a player from 10 hours played, from 100 hours played, from 1,000 hours played? Ask yourself that simple question of what that looks like, because it's possible to create fulfillment from like a short form, simple game, but I think a lot of what creates fulfillment, engagement, people coming back, people continuing to play the game and continuing to be fulfilled, is some form of like progress or change in the player experience. And that's like an easy kind of a short way to ask yourself is like, hours 1, 10, and 100, how do they look different, right? I talked earlier about fulfillment being those two components of like how am I getting the mastery, and how am I getting the stories is the simplest way to probably put it. You're not really going to be able to generate a lot of stories unless you get like invested enough for there to be risk and a scale to difficulty, and to feel like, I finally got good enough. Like I mastered the game, and now I feel satisfied because I learned. And these are games, right? You're supposed to win them, or at least you're supposed to complete them somehow, even if they're not challenging in that conventional gamey way, or just make the stories or make the takeaways. And that takes time to build up to that. It's not something, these aren't like movies where they're extremely meticulous and structured and focused, and the viewer has no input, They're just watching. These are games, so it takes time. So thinking about that is good, and I think meta progression is, as long as it's fun and the core of your gameplay is fun, having good meta progression and the changes between those time investments is really important.
Awesome. Well, Mike, I know we're coming at time here and everything else, and this discussion has been great, but before we close, we covered a lot. What are some tips, suggestions that you'd like to share as takeaways for listeners?
I think it's really important to play test often. I feel like people say this a lot, and it's true. Play test as much as you can, as early as you can. Get your early game, get your game to a point where it is playable. Like you have a little bit of everything. You have like a vertical slice. You have a little piece of all the different systems and layers that you want, and you can play it and play test it often by yourself, play test with the other team members. Make sure that you're trying to kind of like ensure the fun. Maybe it's not there yet, but you're working up to it. And then also do that externally. Do that externally with friends and family, people that you trust, get their opinions, take their opinions and kind of like combine them. Don't over-focus on one person in particular or a couple people. And then also when you're ready for it, playtest finally, I guess, with the community, right? Like the people that you're developing the game for. It's never been easier to combine everybody, to get everybody together to play things through digital distribution like Steam or immediate communication like Discord. So getting that has never been easier. So playtest often in all those avenues. Second thing would be cut as much as you can. Always assume whatever you want to do is going to take a lot longer than you think. Add 20% to your estimates, and that's on top of you already overestimating whatever that is. That new feature, I'm going to overestimate that. I'm going to assume it's going to take a little longer than I think, and then I'm also going to add 20%, and it might still be wrong. Like this is extremely common in game dev. So do those things, cut as much as you can, and then finally, and this is like maybe the toughest one to hear, but I think it's super important. Manage your own expectations for your release. If you're an indie dev, it could take a long time to get to a point where A, you make the game that you want to make, and B, you see success, whatever that is, right? People noticing, reviewing it well, making X amount of money or whatever. Manage your own expectations. Game development right now is very saturated, right? There's a lot of projects. Players have a lot of different choices to make, and they don't have a lot of money, so they're going to make those choices in a really discerning way. They're going to be very critical. Don't give up. Just manage your expectations and say, you know what, like, I think I'm just going to get this out the door in the state that it's in, see how people like it, and then move on to the next thing. And by the way, all that while you're learning, right? You're fulfilling yourself creatively. You're needing to make sure that you don't overinvest in your first project or overinvest in a single project because it's risky. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of indie game devs out there that keep second jobs. They have their full-time job and they're doing indie dev on the side. And honestly, it's a smart thing because it's so risky that you don't want to run into a difficult financial situation for yourself or your family or loved ones that are dependent on you because you wanted to be creative and release a cool game and thought that it would sell better. So manage those expectations, be smart. And by the way, like, we're not really doing this for the money, right? If you need to keep that full-time job, that sucks, I know, and it's exciting and cool, and I'm lucky to be able to work in game dev, but it's one of those things where, given the current climate, you do have to be sort of realistic. But by the way, this is a creative profession. This is something that we can do on the side if we need to, and it can easily transition into full-time in ways that you might not expect. And that's the more optimistic part of what I'll say on point 3 here, is you might be surprised. I know plenty of people that have dropped out of school, that were just modders, that were doing all kinds of odd jobs and nothing in game dev, that because they had a talent and because they demonstrated that, because they had a successful release, they did awesome. So build toward that, work toward that, but be realistic with yourself at the same time.
Awesome. All great points and everything. And man, can't thank you enough for sharing such great details there. Mike, it's really been a pleasure having you today. And also I understand that you have a promotion or offering for people. If you don't mind, share what that is for our listeners. Definitely appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. I do game project consulting. I work in areas of design, marketing, comms, project evaluation, monetization, a lot of different spaces. If you need support for any of that, either reviewing something that you're working on, needing to get another eye on it, or any other kind of support, feel free to reach out. I'm on Twitter. I'm dev_Mikey with 2 E's. My email, contact@czarconsulting.com. Czar spelled Tsar. And also on LinkedIn.
Awesome.
Michael Tsarouhas.
And those will be in the show notes. And Mike, thanks for dropping those links. Hey, and also thank you for being here today and talking about this. It's been awesome and definitely a treat. It really means a lot to me and the audience as well. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. Really appreciate it. Had a good time.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo.